Today's cocktail is the Southside. Southside is a mixture of gin, lime juice, and mint. It is served in a cocktail glass traditionally. There are some rumors as to the Southside's origin and its name. Supposedly its name comes from the south side of Chicago. Its origin is that Al Capone was the lead gangster on the south side of Chicago, and the gins that he imported in that side of town were a little rough around the edges and required substantial mixing to be palatable, hence the mint and lime juice. Conversely, the gins imported to the north side of Chicago were supposedly very smooth and were usually just mixed with ginger ale. It is rumored that the south side was Capone's favorite drink, and that its name, of course, comes from the south side of Chicago. There is a variation called the Southside Fizz, which incorporates soda. I tried this cocktail for the first time last night. I enjoyed it. It's very smooth, a little bit sweet, and that kick of mint with the lime really works very well, especially with the juniper aftertaste of the gin. So I'm not a big gin drinker because I'm not a big fan of juniper berries, but I would say this was a very enjoyable drink. And as always, if you're of age and you have the opportunity, I highly recommend you sample one. Enjoy. Today I own 34 slot cars, 24 Tyco, 11 Aurora AFX. It's been a long time getting to that point. My history with slot cars actually begins in 1979. At the time I was in elementary school, and my grandfather bought me an Aurora AFX track. For various reasons, my parents didn't think it was appropriate for me to play with that unsupervised, and it just became a chore. I could only pull it out when mom and dad were home and supervising, and eventually my dad mounted it on a piece of plywood for me. So it was on a 4x4 piece of plywood, and it had like the green railroad mat, so it looked like grass, and the track was nailed down, but it just, when you gotta wait for one of them to be with you in order to enjoy it, it loses a lot of its luster. So the next Christmas, my dad bought me a Hot Wheels track that was, kid power. It was a wipeout, so it had the hand crank that made the cars loop around, and then, they'd run out of steam just about the time they got back to the crank and then shoot off again. So that worked pretty decent. And that was it for me in race cars, because Star Wars, G.I. Joe, Transformers, all that sort of happened, Legos. So that happened for like the next 6 years. And then Christmas 1986, Santa Claus, quote unquote Santa Claus, brought me the big Tyco set from the Sears catalog, the 440X2 Grand Prix Championship. Just big track, something like 57 feet or whatever. It was the biggest one Sears carried. And it came with 2 NASCAR stockers, and it came with 2 Indy cars. Plus, and I don't remember if this was a mail away or if it came with the track, but there was a Tyco 25th anniversary chrome Buick Regal Grand National, which I still have actually. Let's do a little background here. Okay, so Tyco, the toy company, not to be confused with Tyco, the home security company, which is now Johnson Controls, was founded as Mantua Metal Products in 1926 by John Tyler. Get it? Tyler Company, Tyco. But we'll get to that in a minute. In the 1930s, they began to manufacture HO scale die-cast train sets. They took a break during World War II to support the war effort, and in 1957 they launched their Mantua ready-to-run die-cast trains, which were pre-assembled and not kits as their previous trains had been. They also launched a separate brand, which did still have kits, and that was the Tyco brand, the Tyler Company brand, so Tyco. In the 1960s, they shifted Tyco into ready-to-run trains, and they added HO scale slot cars. By the 70s, Tyco was one of the top brands of slot cars and trains, and some corporate consolidation came around, so Tyco became part of Consolidated Foods, which eventually became part of Sara Lee Corporation, By the 1980s, Tyco was the dominant brand of HO scale slot car and electric racing sets. And they branched into trucks as well, and RC cars, and buggies, and boats, and hovercrafts. Just, you name it, Tyco RC. In 1989, Tyco bought Viewmaster and Ideal, so they got the Viewmaster and the Light Bright and some other things. And in 1993, they purchased Matchbox. But on March 27th of 1997, Mattel acquired Tyco, and Tyco, the company, ceased to exist. They became a brand under the Mattel banner. You'll notice that's when Tyco slot cars began to be rebranded as Hot Wheels slot cars. At the time of the merger, or purchase, really, Tyco was the number 3 toy company in America, behind Mattel and Hasbro. So it was a good acquisition for Mattel, certainly. As I mentioned, my personal introduction to Tyco slot cars came in 1986. And, you know, that was a big deal because I was 12, so that was my last, that was sort of my last toy Christmas, where Santa had put a bunch of toys under the tree. And that year I got 2 Transformers and a telescope. But by far, that slot car track was my biggest attraction. I loved that track. And the funny thing was, Christmas morning when my dad got up, me and him raced it for a while. And then we had, family time and meals and all that stuff. And later that evening, we had a bunch of people over for Christmas dinner. To put it in context, my dad was in the Army, and it was traditional that he invite young single soldiers from his unit, particularly guys that couldn't make it home, invite them over to our house for dinner. So we had a bunch of young soldiers around the house for dinner, and they were all just lining up, taking turns to race me on this stupid racetrack. And I mean, these were grown men. These were, this is America's finest. Let me stop. These were grown men lining up to take shots at me on the slot car track. No different than if it had been a Nintendo, which in 1986 Nintendo was a thing, but it hadn't quite taken over just yet. I had a lot of fun with that track, and as I grew older, I was 12, so figure I was just starting to notice girls, and I also had model rockets, and I had an extensive comic book collection. X-Men was just getting deep into the Chris Claremont era there, so I was really, really into the X-Men. The next few years, I'm leaving middle school and getting into high school, and the slot car track became less important to me. Other things were happening. I got a couple of RC cars. I started getting into RC planes, even though I did not own one at that time. And I got big into model rocketry. So the slot car track came out very rarely. Also, those things get old. The rails start to oxidize. The pickup clips start to oxidize. It requires maintenance to keep those tracks up to snuff. Certainly more maintenance than a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old really wants to get into. But as the video game era took off, none of my friends were interested in messing with the slot car track. So it stayed under the bed. It stayed in the bottom of the closet. I went on to high school and then college, and it moved into the attic. But when I finished college and moved out on my own, my dad was like, you're grown now, so whatever you got here, come get it, or it's going in the trash. So I went home and I got my racetrack, I got my comic books, and I got what was left of my Legos. And they came with me, young adult guy. But at that time, I was really seriously getting into autocrossing and sort of the import tuner scene, because by that time it was the late 90s and early 2000s. The track was collecting dust, but it kept making every move. Every time I moved, I packed that track up because it was still in its original box, and that was the thing. I disassembled it and put it all back in its original box. And so the box was easy to slide under a bed or in the bottom of a closet or on the top shelf of a closet, and there it sit. Fast forward a couple of jobs and a couple of moves later, it's 2013, And I bought my second house at that point, and I'm, I'm past 30 at that point. I'm approaching 40, and I still have that racetrack. And I said, well, bleep, I still got it. I might as well go on eBay and see what I can get for it. And as I started looking around eBay, trying to figure out what prices were and if I could sell it, I suddenly realized that there was a whole lot of Tyco stuff out there and I could buy. And I started buying. So, I did some trading. So I got rid of the NASCAR stuff and got more Formula cars and sports racing cars. And I bought additional track, even though at 57 feet I had a lot of track. But as I started doing internet research, I started figuring out folks have solved some of the problems we used to have. Like if you had a really long track layout and your rails were oxidized at all, or the connection point between the sections of track, sometimes the current wouldn't flow if they got a little oxidation on them. And so your car would go halfway around the track and just die. Or one car would go really fast and the other car wouldn't go at all. And then if you stop that car, then your car would go. Well, that was just a problem with current flow through the track pickups. And, I'm an engineer now and I understand all that stuff. Middle school, high school me didn't quite understand how that worked in terms of electrical resistance and some of those things. But looking on these vintage slot car sites, they had all kinds of information about how to fix some of these things. One of the key things with Tyco tracks is you buy additional power bases, and you can rig it so that you run 2 power packs per track. One power pack runs one car, one power pack runs the other car, and you have split circuits where the cars aren't sharing electricity anymore. So I started collecting additional power units and controllers. I bought some tight radius turns so that I could do some additional track layouts. And basically what I've settled on is 3 different layouts that I can permanently assemble and power on their own sheets of plywood. And I won't have to share parts. I won't have to disassemble anything. I'll just have 3 separate track layouts. And right now I've just got a bunch of spare track. I literally have probably over 100 feet of track. But at some point I will sort out the good from the bad, figure out what's rusty, what's oxidized, chuck it, and then maybe sell the spares on eBay. But like I said, right now I have 34 cars. They all mostly work. Some of them are better than others, but I've got spare parts to start putting them back together. I've got new pickup springs, new clips, new pickup shoes rather. Hopefully none of the brushes and motors are bad, but if they are, those parts are out there. So really what I'm looking at right now is tires and then getting my plywood layouts together, which right now I have the maps that I want, the track layouts, and I have the pieces that I need to do each of those layouts segregated and boxed separately. So I know I got all the parts for each track layout together, and hopefully in the next year or 2 I'll get the plywood and build my racing surfaces and put in the grass mat, and some of them are going to have terrain, rocks, hills, lakes, all that kind of stuff. And I should have some pretty cool layouts. So when I get my next man cave together, because my current living arrangement does not allow for that, but my next house will. It's going to be Tyco slot car, vintage. When people come over, I'll be like, hey, let's do the slot cars. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. It's a hobby that, I was shocked when I went on eBay and when I went on the web and saw how many people were still into this and exactly how many of these parts are still out there and being traded and bought and sold. I mean, there's still new cars, new in package cars. I bought a few. They're expensive, but they're out there. And that's what really got me back into Aurora AFX, because I'm a Tyco guy, but Aurora AFX in their later years had some really nice cars. They had some Group C stuff. They had some high-end race cars that were not available in the Tyco brand, so I made the effort to go out and buy those because the cars are pretty much interchangeable on most tracks. Most types of cars will operate on either track. So I got some additional cars. As far as the larger scale cars, the Scalextrics and the Carrera GTs and some of the bigger European cars, I'm not there yet. Just the space requirements for those larger cars, the costs involved, and the number of parts you have to buy to build a decent layout. That's something I'm not really prepared to dig into right now. Maybe in the future that'll change, but for right now, the HO scale cars work great for me. And it's really more about nostalgia than, I have a real track car to drive now, and I can go out on a real track when I want, but there's something nostalgic and fun about pulling out that old Tyco set and the clickety-clack of the cars and the humming of the motors and the smell of ozone and the resistor in the pistol grip getting warm. And if you're not from that era, it's really hard to explain, but I think people who grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s and had one of these things kind of know the nostalgia and the memories of it and the sights and sounds and smells of operating a HO scale slot car track. So that's my talk about Tyco. If you like my content, please like, share, and subscribe. And down below in the comments, please leave your memories about slot car racing, whether it was HO scale or some of the bigger cars even. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thanks.